And Coley, I did just want to mention, the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is open. I don't know if you want to keep it that way, either way is fine. All right, so I will go ahead and get us started. Just pull a couple things up here. Hi, everyone. My name's Erin Murray. I'm a project coordinator with the History of Black Writing at the University of Kansas. On behalf of HBW and Detroit Public Libraries, I want to welcome you to the Public Humanities and Community Engagement, the Millican Massacre and Residual Violences webinar. This webinar is part of HBW's Black Book Interactive project, which expands access to the digital humanities. This year is also HBW's 40th anniversary. And for 4 decades, HBW has committed its efforts toward literary recovery, digital preservation and access, and innovative programming. We invite you to visit our website at hbw.ku.edu. I'll drop the link for you all to learn more about our work and how we've been celebrating our 40th anniversary. Lastly, I want to invite you to follow us on social media. I'll be putting all of our handles across our various platforms in the chat for you to explore, and we'd really love to connect with you. And with that, I would like to introduce our presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Toniesha Taylor. She is the department chair and professor of communication in the Department of Communication Studies in the School of Communication at Texas Southern University. Her research melds the boundaries of womanist rhetoric, Afrofuturism studies, intercultural communication, gender communication, and digital humanities. Toniesha's recent research and conference presentations center on womanist rhetoric as a method and theory, practical social justice pedagogy for faculty and students, and digital humanities methods for activist recovery projects. Recent publications include Signifying Shade as we #race together, drinking our #new Starbucks drink, white privilege Americana extra whip. In Digital Black Atlantic and World Making or World Breaking, a Black womanist perspective on social media crises and higher education. Dr. Taylor is working with colleagues on 2 major grant-funded projects, a Mellon Foundation-funded project titled DEFCON to increase collaboration and inclusion of Black and Brown scholars in digital humanities. The second grant is with the NIH, focused on increasing the equitable inclusion of people of color in medical trials. Dr. Taylor is the founding faculty director of the Center for Africana Futures at TSU. In addition, Dr. Taylor is an affiliate of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies at NYU and a national teaching partner for the Colored Conventions Project. Dr. Taylor is an active member of the National Communication Association, where she serves as the book review editor for the Quarterly Journal of Speech. Dr. Taylor is a member of the Western States Communication Association, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and a life member of the California State University San Marcos Alumni Association. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Amy Earhart. She is an associate professor of English and affiliated faculty of Africana Studies at Texas A&M University, a 2020 Texas A&M University Presidential Impact Fellow, and a 2019 Texas A&M University Arts and Humanities Fellow. Earhart has participated in grants and fellowships received from the NEH, ACLS, and the Mellon Foundation. In 2020, Earhart received an NEH Mellon Fellowship for digital publication for her book-length digital project, Digital Humanities and the Infrastructures of Race and African American Literature. She has also won numerous teaching awards, including the University Distinguished Achievement Award from the Association of Former Students and Texas A&M University. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar presenters, and we are looking forward to hearing what they have to share.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to see
Thank
everybody
you.
here. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen to get to our slides, and then we'll get going. I think if I remember correctly, we're going to have you all put your questions into the chat as we go along, the question and answer, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. So hopefully that will work. Does that seem okay with everyone? Looking to see. All right, so I'm going to let Toniesha start and just introduce herself. Then I'll introduce myself, and we're going to sort of play tag and switch off back and forth. But I'll let Toniesha kick it off.
All right, thank you. So today let's go to the next slide, actually.
Okay. Oops. There we go.
Oh, there we go. Erin shared our bios, but this allows for a little bit of shameless self-promotion and for you to be able to also see our contact information on social media and ways to get in contact with us after the talk if you have any additional questions. So shared email, website location, and Twitter and IG handles. Admittingly, because Twitter has turned into such an interesting cultural dumpster fire, I don't spend as much time over there as I used to. But there it is, just in case. I think we're going to go next to you, Amy, right?
Sure. Let's see if I can manage the slides. So my name is Amy Earhart. I am now on Blue Sky. I've moved over there. So if anyone else is on Blue Sky, I am happy to visit with you there. And I wanted to talk about where this project began. So we can sort of start from the very small piece and then move our way out. And I'm going to be diligently watching our time as we go along as well. So this is a long, so the part of this that began our collaboration is a project we called White Violence, Black Resistance, and we were sort of looking for a bucket to put lots of different kinds of projects together. And this is where we started. We've now pulled this page down because we've kind of gone on to other things, but this is where the project started, and we were trying to define our collaboration. And at the time, Toniesha was at Prairie View A&M University. It's a sister school in our system. It was the historically Black institution within our system. And as you can imagine, started out as a segregated school in 1876. Interestingly enough, as Toniesha always reminds me, it is written into the Texas Constitution that these schools are supposed to be separate but equal, including funding, which has obviously never happened. So one of the things we wanted to use a collaboration for was to explore the ways that, the inequities might be sort of breached, and also to think about what it meant to work with these two institutions, particularly with Texas A&M, with all of our historical baggage, which I'll talk about in a bit. The Millican Massacre 1868 project is a longstanding digital humanities research project, and it chronicles what we believe to be one of the largest massacres of African Americans in Texas in the Reconstruction period. If you've never heard of Millican, you are not alone. Certainly Texas students have never heard of it. Texas white communities don't seem to know anything about it. It is a very live issue, however, within the Millican community, which I'll talk about in a bit. A public-facing digital humanities project, Millican was launched in the undergraduate classroom in coordination with work that Toniesha was doing with her classes at Prairie View A&M, and she'll talk a bit more about them in a moment. And since then, it's expanded through a number of community partnerships. Currently, I am expanding and developing a new website, which should launch within the next year, I hope. And this website I hope will give even more detailed information about new developments with Millican. The other thing I want to emphasize is how important this project is in terms of the local community. For me, it was very important to remind those students and faculty members working on it that this is an incident that occurred 13 miles south of the Texas A&M campus. and that there was back and forth between Bryan, Texas, which was the other town in the area, and Millican during these events. So let me just give you a little background on it. This is a new website that's being developed. The Millican massacre occurred July 15 through 17, 1868 in Brazos County. And after several confrontations with white mobs, Reverend George Brooks, a local Methodist Episcopal minister, Union League organizer, and voting registrar, organized the Black community to defend themselves against increasing white violence, running military drills and instituting checkpoints around the Black neighborhoods in Millican, which at the time was called Peterborough. A false rumor spread that a freedman, Miles Brown, had been lynched by a Holiday brother or brothers, a white family that had enslaved numerous Black Millican residents. The white rumor mill still believed that the Black militia, they came to believe that the Black militia, which they saw was led by Reverend Brooks, had set off to lynch the Holidays as retribution. This touched off 3 days of confrontation and ended in the lynching of Reverend Brooks and the murder of somewhere between 500 and 300 Black Millican citizens. Newspapers are incomplete, historical records are incomplete. From our research, we tend to believe that the higher number is actually far more accurate. The 5 comes from just a set of names that are listed in the initial confrontation. What's fascinating about this event, I think, in terms of our current remembering and memorying, is that newspapers covered the event from France to Panama, Edinburgh to San Francisco, Hamburg to New York, suggesting the interest in and importance of the Millican confrontation. Foreign newspapers such as this Austrian New Free Press weighed in, and my German is not the greatest, but effectively what this translates loosely as is a riff off the very famous Sheridan quotation, "You may go to hell, but I will go to Texas." And what the Austrian paper reads is, "You may all go to hell and I will go to Texas, yet Texas does not seem better than hell for Black people." And then the rest of the article, strangely enough, goes on to say that German immigration, Austro-Hungarian immigration to Texas is centrally important because they will fix this problem of race, interestingly enough. Also documenting this event was former Texas Governor E.M. Pease, who wrote a letter to his wife, and that letter was after the events of the massacre, and he stated, there'd been a massacre of freedmen at Millican in Brazos County, what we can call a riot, his term, in which Negroes alone were killed. And that's an important piece of information, I think, to the puzzle of Millican. As well, there was, as often is the case with coverage of these sort of large-scale racial violences, most papers agreed with Pease and called the events a riot, even though it was really clear that it was a racial violence, a massacre. And there are very few papers at the time that rightfully called the events a massacre. One of the few was the Daily Austin Republican paper. And as you can see, this paper says there was a fearful slaughtering of the colored people in and around Millican, and sets the number somewhere between 15 to 50. I had a student who was a journalism student, and he was bound and determined to find both sides of the story, and was sort of surprised that there was really only one side of the story being printed in the newspapers. So it was an interesting event for him to go through. The other interesting thing about this event is that the events continued to be re-mentioned and recounted in Republican election materials leading up to the 1868 election. So this is the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Telegraph, noting that one must remember Millican as well as New Orleans, Memphis, Camilla, and St. Landry. Interestingly enough, and I've started to do some work tracing this sort of mentioning of Millican in later papers. As Toniesha and I began to develop this project together, what we initially sort of thought was this could be a tool not only to help our students understand this important historical event, but to learn digital humanities skills and to learn research skills, and perhaps even to learn about each other's universities. And central to our pedagogy with this is the use of open source digital materials, such as the Portal to Texas History, which is a really amazing site that we often teach as part of our research component to this project. We both realized how important such materials available to students and the broader community were to understanding histories that many would like to erase. Accordingly, the work that we've both completed since the start of the project eight or so years ago has been to make sure that our work is similarly open and available so that we can get beyond the paywalls of the university. As part of our desire to open resources to the largest public, we've worked with community groups, inviting them to campus and showing them that all sorts of collections that we have could be utilized by them. And for example, the Camptown 10 historical group, which came to Texas A&M, were very interested in our archival collections on Black churches of Texas. Some of these materials contained information about their home churches that they did not have access to. And we could talk a lot about the ways that this is a very problematic use of, a white public institution sort of sucking up Black history and putting it in our archives and then paywalling them. So we wanted to open it up. Additionally, we applied for and received a historic Texas historical marker to commemorate the Millican massacre. And I'll talk a little bit more about the final stages of this marker, but it has been granted, it has been sent to the Foundry, and we are waiting for TxDOT, the Public Works folks, to put it in place. The community was very invested in our application, as the only marker in the town that was there previously was commemorating the Confederate camp during the Civil War. There were no other markers. Instead, our marker will be placed at the location of the Brooks Chapel Church, the church that was named after Pastor George Church, who led the resistance during the massacre. Further, we wanted to let others in academia know of our approach and our work. So we wrote this chapter for an edited collection. And what I think Toniesha and I are really proud about with this is that it also is an open access article. So even though the audience is an academic audience, it's there for the world to utilize. Toniesha, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. So the other project that came out of this was the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project and the collection of works that we were able to do. So for this project, we engaged in collecting oral histories from women that had had a 30+ year relationship to the university. So this meant that we collected oral histories from faculty, staff, students who would be alum, and then other community members who were part of the larger community for the university. I think next slide. So we collected over 100 hours of audio and video interviews. Now I teach when I was at Prairie View, I taught in the languages and communication department. So the students who were collecting these interviews were mostly communication majors, but there are also a lot of English majors, humanities minors, and world languages majors as well. And so what was really exciting about this is I was able to teach all of them interviewing skills sort of germane to communication majors. We collected and worked through over 1,000 artifacts and ephemera. We created a dedicated digital archive of collections in private and public collections. There is still, if you send a request to Prairie View to their archives, a collection of artifacts for the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project that you can actually access. And if you're in Texas, in Waller County, I'm yay you, because it's really hot this time of year. But if you plan to take a trip down to access the archive, you can. This collection still remains an active collection to this day. We also did an annual public display curated by the PVAMU Archive and Library in collaboration with my students for Women's History Month. We also did this during the founding month for the university as well, which is in August. And so it was a really nice collection. It still is a really nice collection. Other faculty and students have continued to participate in this collection from the art from architecture, history, and sociology. So there's been an expansion to the collection and the research questions since I left. The Prairie View Women's Oral History Project. Oh, I think this is on the next slide. Next slide. So this project allowed me to engage my students in a set of teaching and research methods in digital space and digital media. Students learned to build a digital exhibit, to do some digital curation work and visual analysis of war histories. It gave them an opportunity to think through how we ask questions of archive, what kinds of things in an archive remain behind a paywall and why. It allowed them to ask questions about whether or not that should even happen and what kinds of things that the university held, that PVAMU held, but what kinds of things did Texas A&M hold that were actually Prairie View's history and why was that happening? And so it was a really exciting program and project. So the first 4 students that enrolled in my Principles of Writing class, which was COM 2513, which is still taught there, got the opportunity to use Omeka to create digital collections. I actually know that 2 of these students have still kept their, because they built a free Omeka site, they've still kept it open. The other 2 students built their site as part of the institutional site, which actually has been sunset. And I'll talk about intentional sunsetting of projects in a moment. Before we leave this slide, though, I want to say one of the things that was really exciting about this program and this project for the students is the way that we also talked about how you turn this into work for career. And so of the two of the 4 students actually went on to work for museums and public libraries in digital collections and videography. And so that's a really exciting opportunity because it allowed them to create short documentaries from public library holdings or museum holdings specifically about Black history and to really kind of get stories of the archive out into the community, which is really exciting. Next one. So the intentional sunset of this project. So this project was sunset 7 years ago now, and was sunset due to a lack of funding support, really. And one of the things that I have since been able to do is actually stand this project back up again and expand it. So it won't be listed as the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project. It'll now be listed as the HBCU Women's Oral History Project. One of the things that the intentional sunset allowed us to do is to really look at and plan how we would, or how I would expand this project beyond just Prairie View. Even in the process of collecting these oral histories, I had a lot of my students whose moms, grandmothers, sisters, cousins went to Prairie View, but I had just as many whose family members went to Texas Southern, they went to Wiley, they went to Xavier, they went to Southern or other HBCUs throughout the country. And they wanted a way to be able to share their family stories in the same way that we were sharing the family stories and professional stories of Prairie View women. One of the things that was really important to me and really important to my students in this process is being able to share the stories of women in higher education, to be able to show that Black women who attended higher education now and in the past really became major community partners. They became individuals who did a lot for their communities overall. One of my students who was a communication major and an education minor got really interested in finding the history about the woman that her elementary school was named after. And it turned out she was an early Prairie View alum. And so these projects allow students to find out and ask and answer a lot of different questions. Some of my favorites were students who found out about their own family members who had attended Prairie View and what their life was like as early students. One of the things that my students were very upset about until they really dug and asked a couple of more questions was that in the first 55 years of Prairie View's history, women had to pay a uniform fee, but men did not. And my students were very agitated at first until I said to them, well, let's look at why this might have happened. And then they became way less agitated when they realized that the men didn't have to pay a uniform fee to go to school there because they were all enlisted in the Army by registering for school there. So they all had a uniform. Women did not, because women were not force enlisted. And so they had to pay for their uniform. They all decided they were better off going to school in the 21st century. Next slide. So what are some of the dangers and opportunities of doing public digital humanities work, particularly work that's focused on institutions like Prairie View A&M and the relationship between Prairie View A&M and Texas Southern? We'll start with the opportunities, or as one of my other current students in another area calls the rose and the thorns. The opportunities are things like being able to deliver a talk at South by Southwest in 2017 about digital humanities and Black digital archive work, and the opportunities to really be able to get these stories out into the public sphere, especially these undertold stories about Black, Indigenous, Latino women, LGBT. All of these communities are, I think, in another publication, Amy and I talk about the fact that all of these stories are locked in archives, often away from the communities that these stories are actually about, and these histories are actually about. And one of the opportunities I think that partnerships and collaborations like mine and Amy do is really allow our students to be able to dig around and find these stories. They find stuff way faster than the two of us could on our own. Um, and I think at one point, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think at one point we both had over 125 undergraduates that we were teaching, which meant we had 250 people out there digging around in archives with a set of really great research questions that Amy and I were interested in, but also great research questions of their own. In relationship to the Millican massacre, I had one student who actually was raised in foster care, and she became really curious about what happened to all the children, right? And so she started digging around and was very disappointed to find that there wasn't a lot of information about what happened to the children of the massacred parents. But through some oral history, she was able to find that a lot of the children were taken in to other families and were moved out of the community. But her interest in finding out what happened to them meant that that was a question that was asked that no one had asked before that. And so a lot of times the opportunity here is an opportunity to really ask and answer new questions about old archives. The danger sometimes is that it could mean that in terms of professional career, you may have a limit to your career, right? So it's possible to not earn tenure, it's possible to not be promoted, it's possible to be let go from your institution. I think that Amy and I both took sort of a, well, if that's what happens, then I guess we'll just go find something else to do kind of attitude about it. Because getting uh, these stories out there and being truthful and honest about these histories was way more important to us than than anything else, and making sure that our students understood how to engage and really get these stories out was also incredibly important for the life of our communities. And so now, does that mean that doing this kind of work is always going to mean a threat to your career? It doesn't actually. There are ways in which you can do this work and be honest, be critical, be revolutionary, and still become full professor, right? And a lot of that is about mentoring, and a lot of it is about engagement and preparation, which is something I can talk about separately. But let's go ahead to the next. So roadblocks in funding and technology, boy, howdy, were there a lot of those, especially earlier on. One of the things that Amy and I talk about in that first essay are the things that kind of that tripped us up and sort of the department, college, and university kinds of things. And those really do feel like lions, tigers, and bears. And so I think some of the department roadblocks that we both hit a little bit is that when we started this, we were both pre-tenure. Um, People have asked over the years if I would do it again, um, knowing the possible dangers of doing a project like the Millican massacre as a pre-tenure faculty, and I would. I would 100% do it again. I would 100% sign up for this. Um, Even though it was there were dicey moments in my evaluations around it, particularly because I'm not from Texas. And so there were lots of cultural things that I didn't know and could not have prepared for because I'm not from the space, right? And so I didn't know how much of this was going to be a problem until it happened. I was shocked at some of the emails that were sent. But those roadblocks can also be about understanding doing public humanities work outside of history is not easy. I think history as a discipline understands public humanities work in different ways, whereas in communication, we don't really frame it that way. And so just being able to explain it as valuable work to my department, to my college, and to my university was a roadblock in and of itself. Funding was also an issue. I don't know how many different kinds of like weird sort of folds and strange little things that Amy and I had to do to be able to use like personal research funds and departmental research funds. And I feel like I feel like we wrote a lot of reports just to get like $150 to be able to do trainings or use particular kinds of software. But um, I think the one thing that I know Amy and I have talked about over the years is that, you know, even in the way we titled our initial paper was around this sort of DIY idea of digital humanities, that you do need funding support on some level in order to be able to do this well. This is not a free activity. Um, and so uh, we didn't have support in some ways that people think of in terms of funding support, but we did have funding support in other ways. There were times when Amy and I both had course releases to be able to specifically develop particular kinds of aspects of our research agenda. And so that does provide a kind of funding support. I think in some ways we had the funding support of our students too, because there were students who paid for their own tools because they got excited about how these projects could be done and wanted to do them in new ways. In terms of technology, you do sometimes have to talk to your upper administrators like they're third graders from 1982, which is fine because I was a third grader in 1982. But also not fine because you really do sometimes feel like, but you should be better. But that if you can do that, if you can master that, you can really get more of your community behind you. Because people tend to think of technology as still something that they don't quite understand and is a little bit scary. And so being able to break down the technology and the ways that you're going to use it really helps, especially in public humanities projects that are public facing, that you want the community to get engaged with. Doing the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project really meant that I had to explain technology and how we were going to use the oral histories that these women provided, but also keep them secure. We did have some who were concerned they didn't want their oral histories to end up in other institutions. And so we did have to talk about how those how we would use technology to ensure that the original oral history remained at Prairie View A&M. Because especially for those that were alum, they were doing this because it was PV. They weren't doing this for any other reason. And so they wanted to make sure that their oral history stayed tied to the institution that they loved. Okay. Next up, I think, this is,
Yep. So I want to talk about, sort of switch gears to talk about how these projects, which we started as fairly small scale in-house institutional, cross-institutional projects, have grown in the sort of ways that reaching out to the public and communities have shifted the kind of work that that I've been doing. Sort of, when Toniesha moved, we kind of decided that we were going to sort of split these apart and kind of go in our own direction. So I want to tell you what I've been doing in the past, 6 or 8 years, or 6 years, I would say, since we sort of switched. I can't remember how long Toniesha's now been at Texas Southern. A while. So one of the things that I've found with Millican is that it is a far larger event than what folks might have originally believed. And part of my project has been to continue to get the word out to communities. My proudest event was when my daughter was a junior in high school, and she texted me in the middle of the day, which was unusual. And she said, "Mom, I'm in my IB history class and we're talking about local history. And guess what we just did?" And I was like, I have no idea. And she said, my history teacher just pulled up the website and we talked about Millican. And I was like, hey, that's my mom. If you know anything about Texas schools, the ability for a teacher to bring in a Black history event, particularly with racial violences, is quite dramatic. So I have to say that told me that one class of students learned something that they wouldn't in a normal sort of Texas curriculum. So it's that kind of work that drives me. The other thing that I find is that Millican's everywhere. So Leah Faught, who's a scholar at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York, had put this particular blog post up, and you can see 2012. I found it a number of years later, but I was completely intrigued by the fact that this is a letter from Perry Downs, who was Frederick Douglass's half brother. And he talks about going to Millican because he believes that's where his wife, who was sold during enslavement, ended up. And shockingly, I mean, if you know anything about 19th century history and newspapers, you know that people put all kinds of ads up post-Civil War looking for family members, and many never found them, folks who had been separated during enslavement. Shockingly, Perry gets to Millican and he finds his wife and he says, I'm still living with her. I'm doing pretty well. And he ends up being sent money by Frederick to move his wife and himself closer to Frederick. There's a scholar, Ezra Greenspan, who's been doing a deep dive into this for his book on Frederick Douglass. And the Texas connection, I think we will find with Douglass is a lot more stark. And what also interests me is this letter is written just before the massacre, and I suspect that Perry had moved prior to the massacre. But another mystery. The other thing that I've been spending a lot of time on is learning about George Brooks. My colleague here at the university, Bill Page, who's sort of an intrepid, self-taught historian of the local area, pointed out that the New Orleans Advocate, which is a Black Methodist Episcopal newspaper, in 1868 actually put out an obituary for Brooks, and it gave us lots of clues that we did not have about his life. We know that he was a Methodist Episcopal minister. From the research we've done, he married at least 54 people in the local community, probably a carpenter or machinist. And interestingly enough, in this obituary, they say he was a U.S. colored troop. So we've been trying to find more information on George Brooks, and the information pre-Civil War is always spotty for Black history, but we've been trying. We found other suggestions that he was buried in an unmarked grave once his body was recovered, probably because no one wanted him to be dug up and desecrated by the white community. What's fascinating about this newspaper report, which was a tour of the various Methodist Episcopal churches by this particular man, he says, he was buried in this unmarked grave beside a roadside, and someone should put a marble slab on his grave. That's really the last notation we have in print. But through my work with the community and hearing oral history stories, the community is pretty sure they know where he's buried. We've looked at the site. So we're going to perhaps have a local person here at Texas A&M who does ground sensing work. He's done work at Normandy, for example. We'd like to have him come out and see if we can confirm that that might indeed be Brooks's grave, and to honor Brooks. The other thing that happens with these projects is they spin out and connect lots of people. One of the more interesting things that's happened is the obituary says that Brooks was trained at Thompson Biblical Institute in New Orleans, and Thompson Biblical Institute has been absorbed by Dillard University, HBCU in New Orleans. So I did the thing one does, and you might think about this with Detroit Public Library and how wonderful librarians and archivists are. I contacted the archivist at Dillard and I said, hey, I'm working on this project. I'm looking for information about George Brooks. Do you have anything in your records from Thompson Biblical Institute? Because I was assuming they absorbed the papers when they became Dillard. And he said, well, give me a bit. And he went away. I thought, well, maybe we'll never hear anything. But a number of months later, I received these two clippings from the archive. And what it shows is that the E. Brooks on the left, who was given funding, was in the first class of the Thompson Biblical Institute. And on the right, you can see where he's brought into the ministry. He's given his first charge, which is to go to Millican. So archivists are wonderful people. And I think that's the real advantage for folks who have access to the Detroit Public Library and their archivists there. We found a few new things as well. There's a mention in numerous newspaper articles about this white school teacher and his wife who ran a freedman school. There were probably 3 freedmen schools in the Millican area. One run, intriguingly enough, we think by a man who also had been in Texas for quite a while, running what were called Indian schools. We haven't confirmed that, but looks apparent. And again, Bill Page had a friend who was a Methodist minister, and he said, well, he'll look in the Methodist archives to see if he can find any reference to this white Methodist school teacher. And what he was able to do through a number of sort of deep digs into the archive in a community-minded way, he located Johnson Hensley, or John Hensley, who we believe to be this white school teacher who's mentioned as in these newspaper articles, often, sort of seen as the rabble rouser who stirred up the black mob, if you read the way the newspapers presented this. And so we've been able to document him, and fascinatingly enough, he's a Texas veteran, and his brother was a member of the Old 300, which were some of the original land grant folks, Anglo land grant folks who rolled into Texas. And interesting, given politics at the time, that he would be working at a freedmen's school. So there's more to find there. The thing I want to spend a little more time about before I turn back over to Toniesha is the way that I've sort of been framing this project as part of truth and reconciliation. And by that, I mean, Texas A&M has a long and sordid history, as you might imagine. We were all white, we were all male, we were a military school until General Rudder, who was one of the generals who was who pushed D-Day forward, until he decided in the early 60s to desegregate and allow women in. And as you can imagine, the history of A&M is tied into racial violence. So, for example, this is the Texas A&M yearbook from 1906. I always show my students this, and I say, look at this image. These are folks who are in the Klan, who are students, and they're not even shy, even though they're wearing their hoods. There's their names underneath. They're proud of what they're doing. This is the truth of A&M. We also have Klan robes in our special collections, including the Klan robe. As you can see, the sort of embroidery in the corner there on the right of Coach Bible, who was the winningest coach at A&M. He taught it. He was a coach at other Southern schools, quite famous. We have his Klan robes. So racial violence, segregation, Jim Crow is all tied up with our university. And my students and I have talked a lot about how uncovering the truth and reconciling that to our history is crucially important. And that includes things like the discussion of removing the statue of our first president, Sully, who was a Confederate soldier and we believe owned enslaved people, was a notorious Indian killer, as he was called, wiped out, massacred women and children. That statue is still there. We weren't able to shift it during the Black Lives Matter protests, but we've been able to think about what we're doing as what I call restitutional archiving. And this is a really important piece of the project going forward that I've been working on. That means that we've moved the project to use it as a touchstone or a jumping off point to let the community drive projects. This picture is of Mr. Smith and his nephew, and we are standing on the location of the Brooks Chapel site, which his family owns. And he and I started talking because I thought that's the perfect place to put a historical marker. And we've been talking to him about, can we use this project to help your family? How is it useful? And what he said to me when we talked about where to put the marker, he said, well, I have a problem with my land here. The tax assessor thinks my land, the Brooks Chapel land, is a site three streets over. And that's how it's in the tax code. So we've been working with him to see if we can correct this error. He's been trying for years to correct this error in the tax code. In fact, the man who owns the property 3 streets over has gone in as well, and they just won't shift it. I feel like we might finally be getting some traction on that, but we want to allow the communities to set the goals of the project and to use the project and the sort of weight or power of the work that we're doing and the institution to help them meet the goals. And that's what I'm thinking about with restitutional archivist. Again, Mr. Smith, one of his big issues is Black heirs land, which is being lost across the country at a very rapid rate. And if you know anything about heirs land, you know that one of the things that happen is that folks who want to buy the land can kind of weaponize the way that heirs land is passed down generation to generation. And Mr. Smith and he was able to get a contact at Texas Monthly, which is a fairly large and well-known publication here in Texas. And he asked me to come, and we met with the reporter, and we drove around Millican, and the reporter Nate Blakesley did an excellent job digging into the ways, at least unethical ways, that white developers have been moving to take Black land in the area. And he's starting to get some traction. This story just came out. He's starting to get some traction and hopefully some legal representation that we can, that he can keep the land that's been in his family for over 100 years. So this is about coalition building. This is about matching university expertise to community needs. And just one more example of this, one of the things I'm really pleased, once we had the historical marker approved in this Undertold Stories Texas Historical Commission pipeline, the local historical commission, on which 2 members who sit on that commission and I have been working to document and support the community with the Millican materials, they've decided to start documenting other Black stories in the area for historical markers, which is a huge step forward for us. So the next project that Bill Page has come on to take over is documenting a marker for Stephen Curtis, Stephen Curtis was actually married by Reverend Brooks. He was in Millican during the massacre, and he was the Brazos County delegate to the 1868 Constitutional Convention and the 1867 State Republican Convention. And his life is quite impressive. But what's happening and what's really cool about this is the way that community and descendants can come together for this work. So a number of years ago, I was contacted by 2 descendants of Stephen Curtis, one who lives in St. Louis and one who lives in Maryland. And they said, we're descendants of Stephen Curtis. We've been looking at this Millican website. We're coming to Texas to do some more family history. We'd like to meet with you. We've kept in touch over the years. And now what's really neat about this historical marker is that, Bill Page and the descendants and myself, they're all working together to make sure that there's a representation of Stephen Curtis in the area and to dedicate this marker to him. So that's what I mean when I talk about restitutional archiving and public humanities. What's really important to me is we shift the power balance of scholars going into communities and extracting and then sort of getting their latest project out there or their publication and moving along. I never thought I would be working with heirs land preservation. But some of my work, I'm working now with a number of folks at the university and communities to try to see if we can get some funding to support projects that will help community building to resist the loss of Black land. So this is super important as we think about these projects spinning out, is, instead of extraction, to let the communities set their goals and to find ways that through this process we can support those. So now I'm going to turn it over to Toniesha. I think we've got about 10 minutes left.
Gonna speed on through. All right, so what's next for me? Let's go to the next slide. So one of the big things that's next for me is the Center for Africana Futures. You could go ahead and scan that QR code, and I just realized now I didn't try it, but I hope it works. I'm sure it will. And check out what we're doing at the center. We have a number of projects. One of our big sort of public humanities projects that I'm really excited about. So at Texas Southern, in the School of Communication, we have both undergraduate and graduate programs. So now, as chair of the Communication Studies Department and as a full professor and director for the Center for Africana Futures, I have the opportunity to work with students, work with the community to develop a number of projects. And so one that we're working on is actually the oral history project for the Hester House. Hester House is a Fifth Ward institution. It is one of the oldest continuous settlement houses to turn into a community services center, serving the community of Fifth Ward. And this oral history that we're doing is in celebration of their 80th anniversary that's coming up. We're really excited about that and looking to have that documentary film completed in the next, actually 90 days. And so it's something that you'll see featured on our website and the website for Hester House. Hester House is really interesting. It was started by Julia Hester. She moved from Georgia to Texas with her husband. Her husband was a minister. The two of them never had children, but always supported children in the community. Settlement houses, as they were called, in the 1920s and early 1910s, so the early part of the 20th century, were used to help people who were relocating from one state to the next to be able to meet community, gain access to social services and social resources, particularly for Black folks, for African American folks who are moving from across from one state to another. These settlement houses allowed them to find medical services in the segregated South. They allowed them to find housing, to find and even to find things like for Julia Hester and her husband, they were very engaged in arts and humanities. And so one of the things that they offered was arts education and musical education through their work within the community. So they helped pair local music teachers with students. And so, along with also just providing food services, shelter services, and medical services for community members who are locating in the new Fifth Ward community. Fifth Ward is one of the original wards of Houston, and so it is one of the oldest Black neighborhoods in Houston. And so, really excited about that project and what that is going to become. The center is also engaged in doing work looking at the archive collections at Texas Southern, particularly the collections of Barbara Jordan, and looking at the ways that she used her platform as a politician, also from Fifth Ward, to be able to bring about particular kinds of equities and restitutions to the Fifth Ward community. One of my students who's from Fifth Ward is really interested in how Barbara Jordan worked with community members to be able to keep their homes when the freeways, Highway 10 and 5969, came through and bisected the Fifth Ward neighborhood. And so we're looking at the Barbara Jordan collection and her papers as a lawyer in the ways that she was able to help people keep their homes, and for the people who didn't get to keep their homes and businesses, be able to move, for them to be able to get funding for their property, and equitable funding for their property to not be undersold. Because in a lot of cases, especially the businesses that were eradicated, were second and third generation businesses that were wiped completely out by the freeway coming through the middle of Fifth Ward. So these are some of the projects that we have going on. One of the community education projects that we do is one where, and if you go to the website and click on community education, you will see that one of the things that we offer is a course in how to become a payroll accountant. Now you might be asking yourself, what does that have to do with anything? But being filmmaking, entertainment industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And all of those people have to get paid. And you do not need a college education to be a payroll accountant or a production accountant. And so one of the missions for this Center for Africana Futures is to look at all of the ways that we want to see Black folks throughout the diaspora not just survive in the future, but thrive in the future. And one of the ways that we see that happening is by providing community education into those career structures or career infrastructures that don't require a college education, but will only grow in the future, right? And this is one of them. So we partner with the two largest payroll companies in the entertainment industry to be able to offer training for folks to learn how to be payroll accountants for film and television. And we're partnering with a third group to be able to offer that training starting in February. So if you go to the website, you'll see that it's listing the dates for cohort 1, but if you go back to the website in a couple of weeks, you'll see cohort 2's dates listed up there. Cohort 2 will start in February. And we're really excited about this going forward. We already have, from the 17 cohort members, it looks like 6 of them will have jobs before the end of November. So we're really excited. Some of the funding for the Center for the Digital Humanities projects comes from the Mellon, partnership that we have through DEF CON, which is the Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium. And then we're also receiving funding from other areas as well, mostly private funding. And so a lot of the projects that we're looking at that our research fellows will be unveiling next year. We have projects around using documents around enslavement in the Houston-Galveston area. We have faculty working on projects around voting and voting rights distribution and the ways in which the state of Texas has actively worked against voting enfranchisement for Black and Brown communities. And we also have a faculty member working on a project looking at the ways in which particularly Black and Afro-Latino communities have come together in order to support one another in a goal of being able to keep their heirs and heritage lands intact for one another. And so we have some really exciting things that we're doing in the Center for Africana Futures, and we hope that you will check some of those out. All right, I think questions?
So there was one in the chat just a bit ago from Janice. Janice asked, how would you have approached the project and cultural roadblocks differently if you had been from Texas? I grew up in a northern state, Detroit, Michigan, with both of my parents from southern states, was educated at the University of Michigan, and forbidden from traveling to southern states as a youth at a certain point because my grandparents were fearful that their northern grandchildren didn't know and understand the, quote, Black codes of the South and lived under the veil of being, quote, free Blacks.
That's an excellent question. I think one of the things that I probably would have done differently is asked more questions before leaping forward. I grew up in California. My parents were born in California, which is really odd because usually I was born in the mid-late 70s. My parents were born in the early 50s and were both born in California. And so that means that I didn't have my Southern touchstone was my grandparents. And they lived in California. They had left the South and moved to California. And so it meant that, and my family is not from Texas. My mother's family is from Arkansas. My father's family is from Alabama. Both my mother's parents are from Arkansas. They're from Pine Bluff. And my dad's family, his mother was from Tennessee and his father was from Alabama. And so all of them kind of looked at me like I lost my absolute mind when I took the job, the tenure track job at Prairie View. But I think if I was from Texas, I would have known a little bit more about the racial dynamics within sort of the Waller County area. Even if I didn't know the history itself, right? Like Amy mentioned it was true of my students too. They'd never heard of Millican. They didn't know where it was. They had no idea about the history, even though Millican is on Highway 6 between Prairie View and Texas A&M. So you can't get from one place to the other without passing Millican. And so, and I had students that had made those drives before. Amy had too. And, you know, our students had no idea of the history that they were driving past, but they do know what the cultural, I guess the cultural rules are of the space. And so, yeah, I definitely would have asked more questions about that. I will say, when I told people on my campus what I was doing, the thing I got most often was, "You're not from around here." Right? And I'm like, well, no, I'm not. So either, and I'm from Northern California on top of that. And so Northern Californians were a kind of people who are like, if you're not going to answer the question or solve the problem, then sit down and shut up. Like, and so we tend to be very brusque in that way. And so I definitely would have asked more questions. I definitely would have probably taken it a little bit slower in some ways. It wouldn't have stopped me from doing it, but I probably would have asked more questions instead of just leaping in and dragging my students with me. But we learned a lot.
And I might riff off that too and say, you know, one of the things that I can say as, and I've known this my whole career as a white woman working in African-American literature, it took a long time and a lot of negotiation to build community partners, which is perfectly reasonable. I'm a white lady working at a white institution that has a troubled past, and there's absolutely no reason that the folks I'm meeting with should trust me. So we spent a long time discussing and learning from each other. I grew up in rural Maryland. My family are all central Pennsylvania Mennonite type folks. And there are similarities between the ways that, you know, culturally things work, which might have made it a little easier for me. I recognize very quickly, you know, we have to have a long conversation and develop personal ties before we can get to the business approach. Which I think is interesting. I was even talking about this with my daughter, who's in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve. When she first went there, she did the very Texas thing of like, hey, the cafeteria workers and I have to have a conversation, establish ties. And she's like, she was shocked people didn't do that. So there is a cultural difference there. But for us, what's really clear to me in working with communities is these are not things that are fully gone, right? So the first time I went with Mr. Smith and his nephew's a local police officer, right? Like he's a College Station police officer. And I think if I remember the first time we met on their property in Millican, he actually wore his uniform, which tells you something. We showed up and we walked through the property and we're standing there talking, which felt very similar to me, the way the farmers stand around, lean on the truck and have a conversation. That felt familiar. But at some point, Millican's in the middle of nowhere. And a police car drove by and Mr. Smith and his nephew looked. Mr. Smith said, yep, somebody called the cops because there's 2 Black men standing here with a white woman. So these histories are not gone. And he was right. I mean, there's no reason a police officer should be driving by. And I've been negotiating these sort of issues in Millican, particularly with who to trust and who not to trust, and trying to follow his lead, because there's clearly certain white folks, like white developers, are taking Black land in these unethical ways. And I want Mr. Smith to be comfortable with who our partners are. So I'm sort of checking with him as we move forward and making sure the partnerships are things that he feels comfortable with, because this project should come out of the community, not out of, you know, me. You know, I'm not going to have a dedication ceremony for the marker by calling in all the local white politicians. I'm just not going to do that. We're going to let him set who comes and how we do this and who speaks.
And I would say that even though I'm not from there, one of the benefits of being a Black woman not from there is that trust happens a little bit faster. And I also always leaned on my students who are from there, right? And so I would say to them, hey, you know, what am I missing here? Because this was an odd interaction, right? And they were always really generous to say, oh, well, you didn't really ask about anybody's family, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. And so early on, I really learned a lot about sort of differences in Southern communication. Which again, because my family left the South so early and were gone so long, there are particular kinds of traits that I think others who are my same sort of age, right? I'm Generation X. Is way more common for Generation X people to be born in California, but for their parents to not have been and to have spent time in the South. And my parents didn't spend time in the South. They weren't raised in the South. And so there are certain kinds of communicative styles that they do not have. And so then they did not pass down, right? And some of those communicative styles they do not have and they did not pass down because their parents didn't pass them on to them because they didn't like them. And so what I think has been really interesting about this work too is it's allowed me to go back to my own family and do an oral history with my family to find out why there are certain traditions, certain communicative styles, certain ways that we engage the world around ourselves that changed so much in 2 generations, right? Because that's a huge shift, right? And but it's interesting to be able to do that kind of work sort of internally in my own family, but also be part of these partnerships. I will also say once you gain trust with a community, you can go, it easily can roll into the next project as long as you don't lose trust. Because once you lose it, it's gone. And in a lot of communities, there's no way to get back. And I think particularly in Black Southern communities, that's true. But once you start to gain trust, the projects roll one into the next, right? And so because of the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project, when I moved to Texas Southern, that's actually one of the reasons why I was approached to do the Hester House Project. So I have not, after the Millican project, I've actually never gone looking for another project. They all just kind of roll in. And I 100% know that that's because people find that the way that I do the work and approach the work, they trust it. And it's because they know that I care about what happens to my community, right? That I'm a member of this community and it matters to me how we are discussed and how we are archived and how we are saved. And it matters to me even what is archived and when, right? And that's something that I think is important to be able to have conversations about. It's important, like Amy said, to know who the partners are. And I'm always very clear with people about who the partners are, why we're partnering with them. If there's a problem, I want to know about it so that we can try to resolve that. And sometimes the resolution is you don't partner, right? Sometimes the resolution is you partner on some aspects of the project, but other aspects of the project are not part of the partnership. And so that is really important to give people in the community the control over their own narrative and their own history, and that you as a scholar are not coming in and dictating that to people, but really letting people make those decisions on their own. One of the things I love about the Hester House project so far is that what's really important to them is that they be able to, in this collaboration, dictate what is and isn't digitized because they have records of children and they want to protect the children in their community from being digitized and what that might mean because we don't know what, as one of the directors mentioned, like we don't know what archive will do, what AI will do with images. And because we don't know that yet, because there are not enough policies and parameters around that yet, they don't want that to happen with children's records. Even children who now are full grown adults, I'm talking about people who are 80 years old now, But because the center has records of them from their childhood, they don't necessarily want that done without consent from that particular individual. And I respect that because that's really important. But I also want them to have their records for themselves. So some of their records will be, we'll have a mirror archive, as I like to call it. So we'll digitize them for Hester House and they'll stay at Hester House. And some of them will be digitized and will stay in the archive at Texas Southern.
We have 10 more minutes for questions. If you have a question, you can put your hand up. I'll keep, or just chat in the webinar. There was one thing I was thinking about when Toniesha was talking about that, other than I love hearing Toniesha's grandma stories, which are always lovely and fun, and her grandmother's a wonderful woman. But the one thing I was thinking about with Janice's question as well is that this sort of movement of families is one thing that we've really been unpacking with some of the Millican communities, because Stephen Curtis, for example, who we're working on this marker, his descendants have been fascinated with his movement, and perhaps we think from looking at other records, his movement during enslavement to Texas from Alabama, but then also his movement from Texas through what were at the time called Indian territories, Oklahoma to Kansas, to some of the free Black towns. He and a number of folks from Millican settled in Kansas, in these free Black towns, and that's not an uncommon story for folks in this part of Texas. I always tell people, like, look where folks came from and then look at the railroad lines, right? I had this conversation with my daughter when she got to Cleveland, and she's like, Mom, they don't do X kind of food the way I'm used to it. And I was like, well, look at the railroad line to see if it's a Southern food. Where are the folks from? What railroad line did they come on? And she's like, oh, Memphis. And I'm like, yes, not Texas style, right? So these ideas of travel, I think, are also things that Toniesha and I have been thinking a lot about: migration, and then the ways travel shifts conversations within communities is really interesting to me.
Yeah, especially around, we've talked about food before, we've also talked about language, right? Because Amy is in English and I'm in communication. So we both really ultimately study the way people talk about each other and talk to each other and talk about ourselves and the stories we tell about ourselves. And so even like the words and the languages that survive travel are things that are really interesting to us. The histories that people continue to tell or don't tell when they get to new places are really interesting to us. And so that's something that we find fascinating. I think one of the things that, if there aren't any other questions, one of the things that we also were, or that I was really looking at, in part because of learning about things from my folks at Hester House. So many of them, when the freeway came through Fifth Ward, a lot of people moved to Detroit. And so one of the things I think that y'all might find interesting in looking at your Detroit Library Public Archive and digital archive are a lot of the images of families who are relocated. I started digging around in there and found a couple of names of families that left Fifth Ward and moved to Detroit after the freeway came through and took away homes and businesses. And I found it really interesting. I think I'm going to follow up more with it. I already gave it to one of my graduate assistants. And I'm like, find out who these people are, because part of what we're going to be doing is a digital map around Hester House to be able to show the change over time, because Fifth Ward was split in half when the freeway came through. And so the neighborhood, as a neighborhood, changed in continuity. And so that's something that I think we can see in maps and railroads.
Yeah, and Toniesha sort of gestured to this, talking to communities and collecting oral histories. That's one thing that, in trying to document Millican, most of the materials you're going to find were written by, white dominant cultures very few exceptions. But what has not been lost is that oral histories can be can help us point towards certain things. So for example, we had a guest speaker in our class, a pastor. He's descended from Miles Brown, and Miles Brown was the freedman who was supposedly lynched and sort of kicked off the massacre. And he said, oh no, Miles Brown is my great uncle, and family story says that he escaped and wasn't killed, and he went across the river to Washington County and lived there for a while. Then he came back to Brazos County under an assumed name, moved to Bryan, and had lots of kids and a family and, the like. And my students were really intrigued with that and started to dig around. And we found in the historical record in the census, a Miles Brown in Washington County in 2 years after the massacre, same age. If you look at census, people are often marked by colorism, this problematic way of looking, same markers. He was working as a field hand for a Black farmer. And my students were like, I think this is the same guy. This proves he did escape. And we've had numerous oral histories that have pointed us to these new discoveries. And part of the next phase of the project, I hope, is that we're building trust with folks and hope that they will agree to have some videotaping, perhaps, or given little excerpts of their oral histories of their family stories, because that's what's going to fill in gaps that white dominant media wouldn't. So I see we have 5 minutes. Any other questions? Tanisha, do you have anything else you want to cover?
I would just say that one of the things that we've talked about over the years is the politics of oral history. And it is something to think about, but it's not a reason to not take them. I think a lot of folks think, and oftentimes, especially, we talk about oral history as unreliable. And that always disturbs me, because I don't believe that. I don't believe that oral history is unreliable. I believe that oral history has a political use, a cultural practicality, and that there are reasons why narratives are told in particular kinds of ways. And what you have to do, especially when you're working in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, whether you are a member of that community or not, is establish enough trust with people to find out the reason why, right? Because they know why the story is told a certain way. Someone told them why we tell the story a certain way. And they will tell you if they trust you to know that information. And I think that's the thing that I enjoy about this process too, especially in doing oral history in Texas, being from California, is finding out the why of why the oral histories are told in a particular kind of way, and what the community believes that gives them, or protects them from, or allows them to engage with. So I hope that y'all will think about collecting oral histories, or even listening to oral histories. Listening to oral histories is you learn so much about the world by listening to collected archived oral histories.
Okay, Erin, I think we're just about out of time, aren't we?
Yeah, so we can go ahead and close things up. I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Taylor and Dr. Earhart for taking the time on a Saturday, and for all of you taking time on a Saturday to attend and to learn more about the work that they're doing and what's coming up in the future. I also do want to bring your attention to the chat. There were quite a few links that were shared. We invite you to explore them, to look further. And Dr. Earhart and Dr. Taylor, if you would like to share your contact information, if folks want to reach out, maybe put that in the chat as well. But that, I believe, is all that I have. And Erin, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, may I just ask, this has been recorded. Are you all going to put it up at the HBW? I already had an email asking that question.
Yes. So we will plan to post it. I don't know, Coley, what Detroit Public Libraries does with their recordings where you all post, but I imagine that they will make it available as well. But we will make sure to share on our website and make sure that it's available to everyone. Thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Earhart. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending. We hope you took a lot from this presentation and this webinar, and we hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you all. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.